Most of the soldiers on Praxis 9 didn't know where Kerova was. The Cathari definitely didn't. I barely knew, and I'd read the briefing files. Here's what I knew. Kerova is a human colony world. Barely human, some people say, though that's not fair and it's not accurate. It's just what people say when they want to explain away something that makes them uncomfortable. Kerova is real, it's human, and it has been killing its colonists since the first ship landed there approximately 93 years ago. It's a Deathworld. Not officially classified as such. The bureaucrats who do the classifying have a long list of criteria, and Kerova technically doesn't hit all of them. But in the field, in the places where people actually talk about what they've seen, you call Kerova a Deathworld and nobody argues with you. The atmospheric pressure is 1.6 times Earth standard. The gravity is 1.3 g, the average temperature in the temperate zones. The zones humans settled in, mind you, the most habitable zones, is roughly 2 degrees below what most Earth-standard humans would call comfortable, and it drops another 40 degrees in winter. The wildlife is aggressive in ways that seem almost personal. The flora has at least 3 varieties that will actively attempt to restrain and consume medium-sized animals, which includes humans. There are electrical storms that roll across the highland plateaus for weeks at a time. The ocean, and Kerova does have oceans, beautiful ones, terrible ones, produces rogue waves that can reach 40 meters during the storm season. And people live there. They've been living there for nearly a century. And here's the thing about people who survive in a place like that, generation after generation, they change. Not in any science fiction kind of way, not overnight, not dramatically. Just slowly over decades, the way any population changes when the environment demands something of them. They get denser. Bone structure, muscle mass, lung capacity, all of it calibrates upward. Their nervous systems run faster because slow reflexes get you killed. Their pain tolerance becomes something you can barely measure on standard equipment because if pain stopped you on Kerova, everything stopped you on Kerova. Their children are born into gravity that would make an Earth child strain. They walk in it, work in it, play in it, run through electrical storms in it. They grow up fighting things that want to eat them. They grow up in cold and pressure and a kind of beauty that only exists in places that are actively trying to kill you. By the time a caravan reaches adulthood, standard adulthood, 18 years, they have a body that has been quietly engineered by the cruelest testing environment humanity has ever colonized. Mara Solis was 22 years old. She had been growing up on Kerova for 22 years. I first met her 2 weeks before the sparring incident. She'd been assigned to our coordination unit as part of a cross-training initiative, one of those top-down ideas from the Unified Corps Command that sounds logical on paper, and is occasionally an absolute disaster in practice. The idea was to embed UHEC soldiers with Cathari training units so both sides could learn each other's combat doctrine, build trust, improve joint operational capacity. Good idea, really, I believe in it. But the execution required that human soldiers go into Cathari training environments, which are designed for beings who are, depending on the individual, somewhere between 20 and 40% larger than the average human, significantly stronger under standard gravity, and who have been developing their own military doctrine for approximately 400 years longer than humanity has had a standing space force. The Cathari are not cruel. I want to be clear about that. They're not cruel and they're not malicious, and most of the ones I've worked with have a sense of something like honor that is, in its own way, admirable. But they are arrogant. Not individually, some of them are quite humble one-on-one. But institutionally, culturally, as a military force, they have a bone-deep certainty that they are the premier warriors in this sector of the galaxy. And that certainty does not leave room for the idea that a species that only joined the galactic community 40 years ago might have anything to teach them. Commander Vetharak was the distilled essence of that arrogance. He was tall, even for Cathari, nearly 9 feet, with that layered plating along his forearms and shoulders that the Cathari develop in their second decade, somewhere between bone and chitin, naturally armor-forming. His coloration was deep indigo with silver markings along his neck and jaw that indicated, among other things, that he came from a military family that had been producing soldiers for 6 generations. In Cathari culture, that's not something you mention casually. That's something you wear. He wore it. He had looked at Mara Solis on her first day in the facility, and I had watched his expression do something complicated. The Cathari face isn't easy to read if you haven't spent time with them, but I'd spent enough time. I saw the flicker of assessment. I saw the moment it resolved into dismissal. She was small by human standards, about 5'6", compact, lighter frame than you'd expect from someone raised in 1.3G because caravan bodies don't build bulk the way you'd think. They build density. And to Vetharak, she must have looked like something that had wandered into the wrong building. I watched him make his decision about her in about 3 seconds. And I watched Mara Solis watch him make that decision, and I watched her face not change at all. That should have told him something. It didn't. Those 2 weeks, I kept finding myself watching her. Not in any weird way, I want to be clear. I'm twice her age and a sergeant first class, and I have enough personal history to know better than to confuse fascination with anything else. But she was fascinating. In the way a piece of machinery you can't quite categorize is fascinating. In the way a storm front moving in off an unfamiliar sea is fascinating. She was quiet. That was the first thing. Not shy quiet, not uncertain quiet, just the quiet of someone who has learned that words cost energy, and energy on Karova is not something you spend frivolously. She spoke when she had something to say. She listened when other people spoke. She ate quickly and without complaint, and she slept in the same posture every night, flat on her back, arms crossed over her chest, which is apparently how a lot of caravans sleep, because sleeping curled up in uncertain terrain is how you get ambushed by something with too many legs. She trained with the Cathari units every morning. Standard joint training, movement drills, obstacle courses, reaction exercises. The Cathari trainers ran her through their standard curriculum, which they'd calibrated down slightly for her, or what they thought was slightly, because they were operating on the assumption that she was a baseline human in a 1.3G environment and would need the adjustment. She didn't need the adjustment. I figured this out on about day 3. I was watching the morning obstacle run, a circuit they use that involves a lot of elevated terrain, some resistance tunnels, one section with a scramble wall that's designed to test lateral grip and upper body strength at the same time. It's a hard course. The Cathari run it in full training kit, which adds about 40 pounds to their already considerable mass, and they run it well, fast and clean. Mara ran it 3 seconds behind the lead Rai. On the first day, in the 1.3G environment of the facility's gravity-adjusted training floor, which was calibrated to Cathari homeworld standards, actually lower than what she grew up in. I watched trainer Kelvast's secondary eyes blink, the small set above the primary pair that Cathari use for close-range depth perception, and I thought, there it is. There's the moment he notices. But Kelvast was junior staff. He noticed, and he filed it somewhere in the back of his mind, and he kept running the curriculum the way he'd been trained to run it, calibrated down for the human female. Don't overextend her, be patient. And Mara Solis ran the course, and hit every target in the reaction drills, and lifted what she was asked to lift, and never once in 2 weeks asked for a modification or a rest or a reduced load. She never complained. She never bragged either. That was the other thing. Some people, some humans specifically, come into environments like this and try to prove something, try to push and posture and make sure everyone sees them succeeding. That's its own kind of problem. Mara didn't do that. She just worked. Quiet, methodical, consistent. She did exactly what was asked of her, and she did it well, and she seemed to have no particular interest in whether anyone noticed. Commander Vethrak noticed, eventually. He noticed, and he didn't like what he saw. Not because she was failing, because she wasn't. Chapter 4: The Setup. The sparring program was a standard part of the Joint Training Protocol. It was supposed to be exchange sparring, human and Cathari trading technique, learning each other's movement patterns, finding common ground in the physical language of combat. Diplomatic contact sports. That was the intention. Vethrak had a different idea. I found out later, after everything, that he'd been watching the progress reports on the human embeds for the whole 2 weeks, reading them, analyzing them, building something in his head. I think he'd expected the humans to struggle. I think the cross-training initiative in his mind was supposed to be a demonstration, not explicitly, not officially, but in the subtext of why the Cathari remained the senior partner in the joint alliance, of why their doctrine set the standard, of why 40 years wasn't long enough for humanity to stop being the new species who needed to be guided and protected and managed. When the reports came back showing Mara Solis keeping pace with his soldiers, I think something in Vethrak's worldview developed a small, uncomfortable crack. Arrogant people do not handle cracks well. The sparring session was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Facility time, which on Praxis 9 runs on a 26-hour cycle, roughly synchronized with Cathari homeworld rotations. I was there because I was technically the human unit liaison, which meant I was supposed to observe and report and intervene if anything crossed into genuinely unsafe territory. I got there early. Partly because I'm always early, 23 years of military habit, and partly because something in the air that morning felt off. That same instinct. Pay attention. Be ready. The facility's Platform 7 is a large open sparring floor. Composite material underfoot, slightly yielding, the Cathari designed it to reduce impact damage to their own joints, which actually makes it not bad for humans either, better than concrete, better than the hard deck of most military facilities I've been in. High ceilings. Observation rails running around the upper level. Good lighting. The blue-white spectrum the Cathari prefer that always makes everything look slightly like the inside of a very clean aquarium. Vethrak was already there when I arrived. He was in full training kit. The Cathari don't really have casual training wear. Everything they put on carries the weight of formality, and he was flanked by 7 of his senior soldiers. I counted twice. 7 against 1. 1 isn't standard for demonstration sparring. 1-on-1 was the protocol. 7 was something else. I saw Mara arrive maybe 4 minutes after I did. She came in through the east corridor, same quiet walk, same easy posture. She was in standard UHEC training kit, light compression layer, reinforced pants, soft boot training shoes. No armor plates, no padding beyond the minimum required by safety protocol. She had her dark hair pulled back in a high knot. She looked like someone who'd shown up to run a few circuits before breakfast. She saw the 7 soldiers waiting on the platform. She stopped walking for about half a second. Just half a second. Then she walked the rest of the way to the platform and stepped up onto it and faced them. I moved closer along the observation rail. I wasn't sure why. Just that feeling again. Vethrak stepped forward. He was holding a data slate, the session parameters, formally logged and approved through the joint program. He read them out in Cathari first, then in standard, which was either courtesy or performance, I couldn't tell. This session will be sequential sparring. Each unit member will engage the human embed in individual combat. The purpose is cross-technique exchange and stress response assessment. Sequential. Not simultaneous. That would have been insane and also a clear protocol violation. Sequential. Meaning she would fight each of his 7 soldiers one after the other. Meaning by the time she reached the 3rd or 4th, she'd already be tired. Meaning the last 3 or 4 would be fresh and she'd be running on whatever she had left. which, in Vethorak's calculation, wouldn't be much. I almost said something. I was running through the protocol language in my head, trying to figure out if this was technically a violation or just aggressively, pointedly unfair. Sequential sparring wasn't prohibited. The load was within what the protocol allowed for stress assessment sessions. It was within the rules. That's the thing about people who really understand how to use rules against you. They stay inside the lines. Every single time. Mara didn't look at me. She was looking at Vethorak with those flat gray eyes, and she said nothing until he finished reading the parameters, and then she asked calmly, "Is protective gear required?" Vethorak tilted his head. "Standard minimum." "Then I'm compliant," she said. Vethorak turned to his soldiers, addressed them in Cathari, which I understood well enough to follow. He told them this was a demonstration of the difference in capacity between a trained Cathari soldier and a human embed. He told them to be efficient, to demonstrate technique, to show what a century of superior military training produces. And then he added the part that matters. He said no mercy, not 1 ounce of it. His soldiers clicked their amusement. Mara said understood. And the first soldier stepped onto the platform. His name was Keldrath. Junior soldier, youngest of the 7, but young Cathari military is still formidable. He had 3 years of training behind him, and a mass advantage over Mara of something like 130 pounds. He moved like they all move, that long, sweeping gait that looks almost lazy until you realize how much ground it covers per step. He raised his training shield, a compressed foam panel the Cathari use in sparring to simulate blocking, and opened with a standard Cathari forward press. The intention is to use superior reach and mass to crowd the opponent's space and limit their options. Mara stepped left. Not backward, left, out of his line and inside the reach of the shield, which created a problem for Keldrath because the shield was designed to be used at range, and inside that range it was just a large, awkward object he was holding. She put an elbow into the inner joint of his extended arm, the soft tissue point, the equivalent of the inside of a human elbow, and the arm folded. She used the fold to redirect his momentum. He stepped off balance, and she took the back of his knee with a precision strike that dropped him. He was on the floor in about 4 seconds. Silence on the platform. Keldrath got up slowly. He looked at his commanding officer with something in his face that I recognized, the specific expression of a young soldier who has just discovered that something isn't what he expected and doesn't yet know whether to be embarrassed or alarmed. Vethorak's expression didn't change. He gestured for the second soldier. The second was more careful. I say she because the Cathari gender system is more complex than that binary, but she is the closest standard approximation of the social role. She was older, more experienced. Kelrith, her designation. She watched what happened to Keldrath and she adjusted. She opened with a feint, dropped her center, tried to take Mara low. Mara let her come in. That's what got me. She let her come in, waited just a fraction too long enough that I thought, oh no, she misjudged. And then she used Kelrith's own forward momentum to redirect, and the Cathari soldier went over Mara's hip and hit the composite floor at a speed that resonated through the platform. Not hard enough to injure, calculated, precise. Kelrith lay there for a second, just a second. Then she got up, and she did something I hadn't seen a Cathari soldier do in a sparring context. She stepped back and inclined her head. A small acknowledgement, an involuntary one, I think, the kind of thing your body does before your pride can stop it. The third soldier came in angry. His name was Turnak, and I knew him a little. He was one of the more aggressive personalities in Vethorak's unit, the kind of soldier who trained hard and competed hard and didn't separate those two things particularly well. He saw 2 of his unit mates go down in under a minute combined, and he let that anger drive him, which is exactly what you're not supposed to do. He came in fast and hard and stopped thinking. Mara hit him 3 times before he'd fully closed the distance. 3 precise strikes, the same way a carpenter drives nails, no wasted motion, no drama, just the tool meeting the work. The first to the inner wrist to break his grip. The second to the side of the neck, not a killing blow, not even close, but the nerve cluster there causes a momentary cascade if you hit it right, and she hit it right. The third to the knee, same motion as with Keldrath but harder this time, because Turnak was bigger and angrier, and she needed more force to stop his momentum. He went down harder than the first 2. He didn't get up immediately. He got up eventually, but it took him a minute, and when he stood, his leg wasn't tracking quite right, and he stepped off the platform with a gait that was going to need a medical bay to explain. She hadn't injured him. Everything she'd done was technically within safety protocol. She'd hit soft tissue and nerve points and leverage positions. Not bones, not organs, nothing permanent. But she'd hit with enough force and enough precision that the effects were going to linger. And the fact that she'd hit with that much force while remaining inside the safety protocol was its own kind of statement. I was watching Vethorak. His expression had changed. The dismissal was gone. Something else was there, something harder to name. Not fear, not respect, not yet. Something in between, something calculating. He gestured for the 4th soldier. The 4th and 5th soldiers came in together. I know, that's not what the protocol said. Sequential, one at a time, that was how Vethorak had read it out. I saw him gesture to them both, and I opened my mouth, and I was going to say something, I really was, but Mara held up one hand in my direction without looking at me. Don't. One hand, just that, don't. I closed my mouth. Later she told me why. She said, Sergeant, if I'd needed you to stop it, I would have stopped it. If I'd wanted you to stop it, I would have asked. She said it the way she said most things, quiet, no edge, just factual. And I didn't argue with her, because by then I'd seen what she could do, and arguing with her about her own risk assessment felt about as useful as arguing with a mountain about its elevation. The 4th and 5th soldiers were Vethorak's 2 most experienced fighters. I knew their records. I'd read the unit files when I was prepping for the cross-training assignment. Kelmoth had 12 years in the Cathari Ground Corps. Turnbull had 11, with a specialized close combat designation. They were, on paper, the 2 best hand-to-hand fighters in the unit by a significant margin. They came at her from opposite sides, which is the correct approach if you're trying to split someone's attention and force them into a reactive position. She moved. I'm going to be honest with you. I've been trying to find the right words for what she did in the next 43 seconds since the moment it happened, and I'm still not sure I have them. I've watched combat sports. I've watched trained soldiers spar. I've watched some very extraordinary things in 23 years of service. What Mara Solis did in those 43 seconds against 2 experienced Cathari fighters simultaneously wasn't extraordinary in the flashy way. It wasn't showy. It wasn't acrobatic. She wasn't doing anything that looked like it belonged in an action sequence. It was extraordinary the way engineering is extraordinary. The way a well-designed bridge is extraordinary. You look at it and you understand, on some fundamental level, that something with complete understanding of forces and loads and tolerances built this, and it will not fall. She moved between them. Not backward, between them, tighter in, which is the counterintuitive thing, because every instinct says get away from the threat, but she'd already assessed that instinct as wrong for this situation. Tighter in, making their size and reach a liability instead of an asset, because you can't swing something long in a short space. She used Kelmoth's forward momentum to redirect him toward Turnbull. She absorbed a glancing blow from Turnbull's forearm. I winced when I saw it, because Cathari forearm plates are not soft, and she absorbed it and kept moving, using the contact to read where he was going and already being somewhere else. Kelmoth and Turnbull collided. Not fully, these were experienced soldiers and they adjusted fast, but enough. Enough that they split apart and she had a half-second of space, and in that half-second she targeted Kelmoth. What she did to Kelmoth's wrist and shoulder in the next 3 seconds is something I have described to 3 different combat instructors and gotten 3 different reactions. The first said, "That's an old caravan pressure technique. They develop it for fighting in close quarters against larger predators." The second said, "That's not something you can do to a Cathari. Their joint structure doesn't work that way." The third said, "Send me the footage." There is no footage. Vethorak shut off the recording systems after the second round. I noted that later in my incident report. I noted it with some emphasis. Kelmoth went down and stayed down, holding his shoulder. Not broken, I checked afterward, just locked in a position that was causing his nervous system to send very insistent signals that it wanted to stop. And Mara turned to Turnbull, and there was a moment, just a moment, where the two of them looked at each other. Turnbull is 11 years of combat experience. He has been in 3 actual engagements against hostile forces. He is not a coward. He is not the kind of soldier who backs down. He looked at her for 3 seconds. He stepped off the platform. Not a full retreat, he stepped off and said formally in standard, "Round concluded, I yield," and he stepped back. That's not the same as being beaten. That's a choice. That's a soldier looking at a situation and making a professional assessment and deciding that the professional assessment says this is not a fight to finish. I have a lot of respect for that, honestly. The 6th soldier never stepped up. She looked at the platform, looked at the 4 who'd already gone, looked at Turnbull stepping off, and she looked at Commander Vethorak. Vethorak looked back at her. Then he turned and he looked at Mara Solis, who was standing in the center of the platform, breathing in the careful, measured way of someone who's been working hard enough that their body wants them to know about it, but not so hard that they're actually struggling. A small sheen of perspiration on her face. Her stance still solid, still wide, still planted. She was looking at him. Only him. I don't know what passed between them in that moment. I was watching both of their faces and I still don't know. There's a kind of communication that happens between people who understand violence at a professional level, not people who love it, not people who seek it, people who have simply learned its language thoroughly, and it doesn't require words. It doesn't require gesture. It was maybe 4 seconds. Then Vethorak said very quietly, "7th." And his last soldier, the one I hadn't met yet, the one who'd been standing at the far end of the line the whole time like he'd been saving himself for something specific, stepped forward. His name was Varzith. I learned that afterward. At the time I didn't know his name, but I noticed him, hard not to. He was the largest of the 7, the one who made the rest of them look almost average. Cathari sizing has a lot of variation. Their development is influenced by homeworld regional factors in a way that produces a broader size range than you'd get in a lot of other species. And Varzith was at the upper end of that range. Nearly 9.5 feet. Mass I couldn't calculate without instruments, but the platform made a sound when he stepped onto it that it hadn't made for any of the others. He was also the quietest. The whole session he'd stood there, arms folded, watching. Not with amusement, not with dismissal, just watching, processing. He knew his own 7th position significance. He knew why Vethorak had held him back. He'd been watching 5 rounds of material, and he was going to use what he'd seen. He didn't circle. He didn't feint. He just walked forward at a pace that was careful and deliberate, and the size of his steps meant that careful and deliberate still closed distance faster than you'd want. Mara moved. She moved left again, same initial direction as round 1. The only time in the session she'd repeated a pattern, and I thought she was setting up the same elbow redirect she'd used on Keldrath, and I think Varzith thought so too, because his arm adjusted to block it. She went under the block, under his reach, under the whole frame of what he was expecting, and she went to the floor for a half-second, flat, low, both hands to the composite, And then she was back up on his far side, and she had his back and she had her forearm across the rear joint of his leg, and he had about 1 second to make a choice. The choice was, go to one knee on my own or have the knee decision made for me. He chose to go down himself, smart. From one knee he was still huge. He was eye level with her chest from one knee, but she'd changed the geometry, and geometry is everything. She had his back. She had his balance point. She had 3 different options from that position, and he knew she had 3 options, and he was trying to calculate which one she was going to use, and she wasn't using any of them. She held the position. Just held it. 10 seconds, 20. Varzith didn't move. He couldn't, not without giving her the leverage she was set up for. He was in the position and she was keeping him there, and the only way out was through something that was going to hurt, and they both knew it, and he was deciding whether it was worth it. 30 seconds. He said in standard, "How long can you hold this?" She said, "How long do you want to find out?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something in Cathari that I didn't fully catch. My conversational Cathari is decent, but rapid, low-volume exchanges are harder. But what I got from it was something close to, "You are not what I expected." She said in Cathari, "Better Cathari than mine, frankly, no, I'm not." Varzith took a breath. He said formally in the Cathari military tradition, a phrase I recognized, a concession phrase, the kind used in formal unit training when a point of superiority has been established. And then he slowly, deliberately brought his hands away from the offensive position, showing empty hands, yielding. Mara released the hold. Varzith stood. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. And something in that moment, I keep coming back to it, was not hostile. Was not a victor looking at a defeated opponent. It was 2 people who had just spoken a very intense language together and were standing in the silence after. He stepped off the platform. Mara turned and faced Commander Vetharak. Just the 2 of them now. The 6 who could still move were standing at the sides. Kelmoth was still on the floor with a medical bay situation developing in his shoulder. And Vetharak stood at the edge of the platform and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the facility was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. She said, "Was that what you wanted, Commander?" Her tone wasn't mocking. That's what gets me. It wasn't triumphant, it wasn't cold, it wasn't anything dramatic. It was just the same flat, calm, factual tone she used for everything. A genuine question. Was that what you wanted? Vetharak looked at her for a long time. Then he stepped down from the platform. He'd never stepped up onto it, I realized, and he walked out of the facility without a word. His soldiers followed him, the ones who could walk. 2 of them helped Kelmoth. And Mara solely stood in the middle of platform 7 and watched them go. And then she turned and stepped off the platform and walked past me toward the east corridor and said, without stopping, without looking at me, "Is there a medical bay on this level, Sergeant? I think I've got something bruised, the forearm." Just that. Just, is there a medical bay on this level? Like she'd stubbed her toe. I walked her to the medical bay. It's on the 3rd level. The Cathari facility isn't the most conveniently laid out place for humans. The corridors are wider than you need, and the lift panels are at the wrong height, and everything is calibrated for a species about 3 feet taller than you. And on the way there, neither of us said much. At some point I said, "You want to tell me where you learned that, the shoulder thing you did on Kelmoth?" She thought about it for a few steps. "My dad," she said. I waited. Kerova has these things. We call them ridge crawlers. They're about, she measured with her hands, about this long, but the mass is deceptive because they're dense. They like to come up high and drop onto you. The weight distribution when they land puts their center mass in a specific position relative to your body. She paused. Dad used to say if you understand how weight sits on a joint, you understand the joint. He practiced on me. Just the technique, not the actual crawlers. Mostly. I had no idea what to say to that. Mostly, I repeated. She looked at me sideways, just a fraction of a smile, the first I'd seen from her. He was very careful about the actual crawlers. The medical bay scanned her forearm and confirmed a bone bruise from Turnbull's armored forearm, moderate severity, cleared for light duty with compression treatment. The Cathari medic who ran the scan did so in complete silence and didn't meet her eyes once, which I noted and found interesting. The word had moved through the facility faster than we had. Chapter 9: What Vethrak Did Next. I expected retaliation. Not physical retaliation. Vethrak wasn't that kind of commander, not openly. But institutional retaliation. Protocol retaliation. The kind where a formal complaint gets filed, the training session gets reframed in paperwork as a demonstration of the problems with the human embed program. The numbers get arranged to tell a story that has nothing to do with what I watched on Platform 7. He did file a report. I know because I filed one too, and they ended up in the same administrative system, and I got to see the summary. His report was, and I'm paraphrasing here, because the document is technically internal to the Joint Program Professional. Dry. It described the session accurately in terms of the sequence of events. It noted that Private First Class Solis demonstrated advanced close combat capabilities exceeding standard human embed parameters. It recommended revised assessment protocols for caravan-borne human embeds. Not a word of complaint. Not a word of criticism. He filed an accurate professional report, and he made one recommendation, and both were reasonable and appropriate. I read that report twice. Vethrak had been humiliated in front of his unit by a human private who weighed about half what his lightest soldier weighed. He had given an order that backfired spectacularly. He had watched 7 of his soldiers, including his 2 most experienced, fail to put her on the floor. And his report was professional, reasonable, and accurate. That told me something I hadn't fully understood about him before. There was more to him than arrogance. The arrogance was real, but underneath it, when the shell cracked open and you could see what was actually there, there was a soldier. A real soldier. Those can change. Arrogance is a fortress, but fortresses have doors. 3 days after the sparring session, Commander Vethrak came to find Mara Solis. I know this because she told me about it later. At the time, I wasn't there. It happened in the facility's secondary training yard, an outdoor area used for weather adaptation drills, and I was in a briefing when it happened. He found her running the perimeter of the outdoor yard. The weather on Praxis 9 that day was what passes for mild there, about 2 degrees below human comfort standard, light particulate in the air from the seasonal mineral storms that come off the eastern plateau, visibility reduced to maybe 200 meters. Most of the human embeds were inside. She was outside, running, because 2 degrees below comfort standard, and a bit of particulate is apparently what caravans call pleasant. He fell into step beside her. She told me he didn't say anything for almost a full circuit, about 600 meters. Just ran beside her, which for him meant a loose, easy pace because his stride covers significantly more ground. Then he said, on Cathar we have a saying, the deepest water looks still from the shore. She ran for a bit. Then she said, on Kerova we don't have sayings like that. He asked why. She said, because if the water looks still, you check what's in the water. You don't stand on the shore thinking about how deep it might be. He made the clicking sound, not the mocking one from the sparring session, a different register of it, the one that means something closer to I see. He ran another couple 100 meters, then said, the order I gave, no mercy. Yes. You took it as an instruction. You gave it as one. I gave it as. He stopped and she slowed and they stood in the particulate haze and he seemed to be reaching for a word in standard that wasn't quite fitting. Encouragement, he said finally, Or performance, a phrase my trainers used. It has a different meaning in Cathari military context. It means push hard, she said. Show what you've got, it's an idiom. Yes, I know. He was quiet. She said, I took it as an instruction anyway. I noticed. The instruction was fair, she said. You have 7 soldiers and I'm a private first class on an embed rotation. The gap is real. You just measured the wrong things. He didn't respond to that immediately. Then he said, what things should I have measured? She thought about that for a second. Then she said, gravity, atmospheric pressure, temperature variance, time under load, the difference between a body trained in an environment that's trying to kill it and a body trained in an environment that's designed to support it. She looked at him. She said, I'm not better than your soldiers, Commander. I'm not claiming that. But I'm not what you thought I was either. And those aren't the same thing. Vetharak was quiet again for a while. Then he said, no, they are not. He ran one more circuit with her. Then he peeled off at the east gate without another word. That was it. That was the whole conversation. But something shifted after it. In the facility, in the way Vetharak's soldiers interacted with the human embeds, in small ways that are hard to point to individually but were unmistakable in aggregate. A little more time in the corridor before stepping around someone instead of through them. A few more questions in the language exchange sessions. Varzith, the 7th soldier, started eating in the joint canteen instead of the Cathari-only section, which was technically optional for everyone but in practice almost nobody mixed. Small things. The kind of things that don't make reports and don't get noted in official documentation, but are actually, in the long run, the things that matter. About a week after the conversation she described, Mara and I ended up in the joint canteen at an off hour. Neither of us was on shift, neither of us could sleep, and the canteen had a section that served something close enough to coffee that it had become my personal anchor. She was eating something from the Cathari menu, which she'd apparently decided she preferred, because the portions were calibrated for larger bodies and she liked the quantity, and also because whatever the Cathari spice palette is doing, it apparently mapped onto caravan food culture better than she'd expected. She'd been explaining this to me, and I'd been listening with the specific attention I give to things that illuminate how people work. At some point I said, back on the platform, when they came to at once, were you scared? She thought about it. No, she said. Ever during any of it. She put down what she was eating and thought about it more carefully, which told me she was taking the question seriously. When Turnbull's arm caught me, she said, that second. Because I didn't see it fully, the angle was wrong and I underestimated the arc. And there's a moment when you take a hit you didn't fully see coming and your system doesn't know yet how bad it is. That moment is uncomfortable. Uncomfortable, I said. On Karova, she said, we don't use the word scared for things that might hurt you and might not. That's just information. That's your body telling you to pay attention and recalculate. She picked up her food again. Scared is for when you've already decided there's no recalculation, when the options are gone. I thought about that for a while. I said, did you ever think the options were gone? During any of it? She looked at me with those gray eyes, and she almost smiled, the same small fraction of a smile I'd seen in the corridor to the medical bay. Sergeant, she said, there are 7 of them, there's one of me, she paused, in 1.3 G reduced atmosphere, another pause, at home. I stared at her. She went back to eating. I drank my not-quite coffee and thought about gravity and pressure, and what 22 years of them does to a person's relationship with the concept of difficulty. You know, I said, when I read your file when you were assigned here, I almost flagged it. Thought the Deathworld notation was going to be a problem. Thought you might not handle the training environment. She looked at me. I know, she said. You know, everybody thinks that. She wasn't bitter about it, just factual. It's on the file and people read it and they think, problem, liability, accommodation needed. She tilted her head slightly. They measure wrong things. The same words she'd said to Vetharak. I thought about Platform 7. About a private first class in light training kit standing in the middle of 7 experienced Cathari soldiers, and telling the last one, in Cathari, that no, she wasn't what he'd expected. Yeah, I said, we do. She looked at me for a second. Then she said, you didn't measure wrong, you waited. I thought about that. About the moment I'd almost intervened and she'd raised her hand and I'd closed my mouth. About what I'd seen in those 2 weeks before. I thought about measuring wrong, I said honestly. That's different, she said. Thinking about it and not doing it that's what good looks like, most of the time. Things moved differently after that week. I don't mean things changed overnight. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because the kind of change I'm talking about is not the kind that shows up in briefing reports or gets announced at morning assembly. It's slower than that, quieter, the kind of change that happens when a basic assumption gets knocked loose from its foundation and people start, very cautiously, very privately, rebuilding around the new information. The basic assumption in this case was one that the Cathari had held for somewhere between 40 years since first human contact and 400 years, depending on how you wanted to trace it. The assumption was, humans are the junior species. Not inferior in any malicious way, not subhuman in the way that phrase carries in human history. The Cathari don't have our particular histories of those horrors, but junior, new, unformed. Still working out the basics of what they were in the galactic community. Capable, certainly. Worth protecting, probably. Worth partnering with, possibly. But measured by Cathari standards, which meant measured against 4 centuries of their own development and found not lacking exactly but catching up. Still catching up. Mara Solis spent 43 seconds on Platform 7 with 2 of their best soldiers and changed the math. Not the whole calculation. You can't change something that large that fast, but she put a doubt in the equation, and a doubt in an equation changes the answer. And a changed answer, if you're honest about it, changes the question. And questions, once they exist, move. The first one to come find her was Varzith. He came to find her on a rest day, 4th day after the session, in the common area adjacent to the human embed quarters. I happened to be there because I was writing incident reports, which are significantly more comfortable to write in the common area than in my assigned quarters, which have a humidity issue that nobody in the facility's maintenance staff can seem to locate or fix. Varzith knocked on the frame of the common area entrance, the Cathari equivalent, anyway, a short tap with 2 knuckles, and then stood there until Mara looked up from whatever she was reading. He said in standard, I want to understand what you did, in the hold. She looked at him for a second. Which part? The initial positioning, how you created the angle. She put down what she was reading. She looked at him. She said, are you asking me to teach you something? He held her gaze. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up and said, come on. They went to the small training annex off the common area, a room originally designed for equipment maintenance that had acquired a few mats, and a general understanding among the human embeds that it could be used for informal practice. Not a proper sparring room. Not Platform 7. A small, low-ceilinged room with second-hand mats and a ventilation system that always smelled vaguely metallic. I followed at a distance because I wanted to see this. They spent 2 hours in there. I sat in the corridor outside the annex and worked on my reports and listened, and what I heard was mostly quiet. The sounds of demonstration and repetition, not the sounds of competition. At one point I heard Mara say something in Cathari, a technical phrase I didn't fully catch, and heard Varzith respond. And then the sound of movement, slow, deliberate movement, the kind you make when you're learning a position rather than executing one. When they came out, Varzith had that expression again, the one from the platform, the not hostile one. He said in Cathari something that I caught this time. Your weight management is from low gravity adaptation. She said the opposite. High gravity makes you understand weight differently. You stop fighting it. He processed that. Then he nodded the Cathari version, a slow lateral tilt of the head, and he walked back toward the Cathari quarters. He came back the next day. And the day after. By the end of the week, Kelrith had also started showing up. Then Keldrath. Not all at once, they came individually, at different times, with different questions, and Mara answered them all with the same quiet patience she brought to everything. None of this was official. None of it was on any program schedule. It was just learning. Two species, in a small room with second-hand mats and a metallic-smelling ventilation system, figuring out what the other one knew. Commander Vethrak found out about the annex sessions on day 6. I know this because he came to find me. He found me at my usual spot, common area, incident reports, humidity avoidance strategy, and he sat down across from me, which he'd never done before, and he said, Sergeant Ape. Commander. The informal sessions in the training annex. I looked at him. I kept my expression neutral, which is something I'm good at after 23 years. I'm aware of them. Are they within protocol? I thought about it. There's no protocol against them. Informal exchange is encouraged, actually. In the original program design documents, I paused, page 14. He was quiet. I said, are you planning to prohibit them? More quiet. Then no. I nodded. He didn't move to leave. That was unusual. Vethrak didn't linger. He made his point, he left. So the fact that he was still sitting there told me something was coming. He said, what is Karova? I blinked. It was the last question I'd expected. I told him what I knew, what was in the official documentation, the environmental parameters, the population history, the developmental effects on the colonists over generations. I gave him the briefing document version because that was what I had readily available in conversational form. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, the gravity, the 1.3 g, the atmospheric pressure, she grew up in this. Yes. Our training floor, he said slowly, is calibrated to standard Cathari homeworld, which is 1.27 g, I said. He was quiet again. The math was easy and he was doing it. Praxis 9's joint training facility gravity was calibrated to Cathari standard. To his soldiers, that was home. To Mara Solis, it was slightly lighter than home. When Vethrak had set up a sequentially depleting challenge meant to exhaust a human by the end, he'd set it up in an environment where Mara was not depleting at the same rate as he'd calculated. Where the load he was running her through was a load she'd been running under her whole life, but slightly lighter. We calibrated down for her, he said slowly, because we assumed standard human parameters. We made the course easier. For her, I said, yes, you did. The silence stretched. She didn't say anything, he said. She did what she was asked to do, I said. At the level it was offered. Vethrak looked at the table between us. Not at me, not at anything specific. Just at the table or through it, or past it at something he was putting together in his head. He said, on Cathar, when a soldier repeatedly completes a course that is beneath their capacity and doesn't report it, we would consider that a failure of communication. I thought about that. On Earth, we'd probably call it following orders. You would not ask for more. Not always, I said. Not if the environment made it clear that you weren't supposed to need more. Not if every message from the environment said, this is how much we think you're capable of. You'd match the expectation. Or, I paused. You'd wait for the moment when someone finally asked what you could actually do. He looked at me then. I said she wasn't silent because she had nothing to say. She was silent because nobody asked the right question. He stood up. He stood up and he straightened in that formal Cathari military posture, spine pulled straight, hands behind his back, weight balanced. And he said, "In my report, I recommended revised assessment protocols for caravan-borne embeds." I read it, I said. "I'm amending the recommendation," he said, "to revised assessment protocols for all human embeds. The criteria we've been using are insufficient." I looked at him. "The cross-training initiative," he said, "was designed for information exchange between equal partners." He paused. "We have not been treating it that way." I didn't say anything. He said, "I'm scheduling a joint session review, all embed personnel, new curriculum baseline." Another pause. "I'll need your input, Sergeant." "You'll have it," I said. He nodded, the lateral tilt, and walked out. I sat there for a moment looking at the empty space where he'd been sitting. Then I went back to my incident report. I added about 4 paragraphs. The joint session review happened 9 days after the sparring incident. Full facility. All embed personnel, 14 human soldiers from various Earth and Colony World backgrounds, plus 2 Orathi observers who were technically there on a different program, but who nobody seemed inclined to ask to leave. All of Vethorak's unit, minus Kelmoth, who was still in the medical bay with a shoulder that was healing, but wanted more time than he'd originally been told to expect. The session was held in the main assembly hall, which is larger than Platform 7 and has better acoustics, which matters when you've got a room full of beings whose hearing ranges don't all overlap. Vethorak ran it. He opened by saying, and I'm working from my notes here, which I took in real time, the cross-training initiative was established to build operational trust between allied species through direct exchange of technique, doctrine, and capability. We have been conducting this initiative under an assumption that has proved incorrect. The assumption is that we know what our human counterparts are capable of. He paused. We do not. The room was very quiet. Private First Class Solis, he said, will you come forward? Mara stood from her seat. She'd been in the middle of the human section. Nothing special about where she'd sat, just where there was a space. And she walked to the front of the room and stood next to Vethorak and looked out at the assembled personnel with the same flat, calm expression she brought to everything. Vethorak said, 9 days ago, I gave an order in this facility that I intended as a motivational phrase. It was understood and executed as a literal instruction. The result was a demonstration of capability that I should have known existed and did not. He turned to look at Mara. I'd like to ask Private First Class Solis to speak. Mara looked at him for a second. She looked out at the room. She said, I'm from Kerova. She let that sit there. Most of you know something about what that means for a body. The gravity, the pressure, the temperature variances. What's in the briefing files? She paused. What's not in the briefing files is what it's like to be 8 years old and run a kilometer uphill in a thunderstorm, because if you stop moving in that environment, you stop moving. What's not in the files is what it's like to understand, before you're old enough to have the words for it, that the ground you're standing on is always pushing back harder than any environment you'll train in for the rest of your life. She was quiet for a moment. I am not exceptional, she said. I want to be clear about that. What I can do is not unusual for where I come from. There are people from Kerova who are significantly stronger and faster and better calibrated than I am. I'm ordinary by those standards. She looked around the room. What I am not is what you measure for when you look at the standard human parameters. One of the Orathi observers, who had been very still and very quiet until this point, made a low sound. Not words, just a sound. I'd spent enough time around Orathi to know it was the equivalent of a thoughtful hum. The sound you make when something you're hearing is changing the shape of a problem you've been thinking about for a while. Mara kept going. She talked for about 12 minutes. Not a speech. She wasn't giving a speech. She was just telling them things. About Kerova. About growing up there. About the way the environment teaches you things about force and leverage and efficiency that no training manual writes down because no training manual was written with Kerova as a reference point. She talked about her father and the ridge crawlers. She talked about the electrical storms and what you learn to do when you can't be inside during one. She talked about the winter hunts the caravan communities do to manage the large predator populations that move through the temperate zones in the cold months, and about how you hunt something that's bigger than you and stronger than you and better adapted to the cold than you when you are absolutely not going to stop hunting it, because if you stop it'll be there next winter too. She talked about all of it the way she talked about everything, quiet, factual, without drama. But the room was completely silent the entire time. The kind of silence that happens when people are not waiting for someone to finish so they can respond. They're actually listening, actually taking it in. When she was done, she looked at Vetharak and said, "That's what I've got." Vetharak said, "Thank you, Private." He turned back to the assembly. He said, "We will be revising the assessment protocols and the curriculum baseline. The revision will be built on actual capability data, not assumed parameters." He looked around the room. For human personnel, for Kethari personnel, and he nodded toward the Orathi observers, for any other allies who participate in future joint programs. He paused. "We have been measuring the wrong things," he said. "That ends today.